Good morning, everyone. It is 10:30 and we are going to start our webinar today. We are excited that you are joining us, and I am Jennifer Mitchell and I'm responsible for the district's educational resources in this webinar series. Today we have Jody Slater, an environmental scientist in the Bureau of Water Resources, and Jody works primarily on Lake Apopka and focuses on submerged aquatic vegetation. She has worked at the district for almost 11 years and in wetlands for more than 20 years. And so she has a fabulous presentation to share with us today. As everyone is coming into the meeting, I would like to remind you that this is being recorded. And if you want to tune in to anything and focus on it in detail, the recording will be available on our website. It is also being streamed through YouTube Live. So if you have anybody that wasn't able to sign up, feel free to direct them to our YouTube page and they are able to watch it there. We also have a question box on the side. And if you have questions as Jody is talking, feel free to enter those as she's talking, but we will have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So feel free to ask those questions throughout her talk, but we'll have that question answer period at the end. If we do not get to all of your questions at the end of the presentation, we do want to be mindful of everyone's time. We will get an answer to you after the meeting. So we will email you that answer. Everyone will be on mute throughout the presentation. And we really appreciate you participating today and learning more about the submerged aquatic vegetation and their restoration out at Lake Apopka. Jody, I'm going to go on and hand it over to you, and thank you so much for sharing your expertise in this and giving us an update on what's going on in Lake Apopka.
Sure, thank you, Jennifer. First of all, let's start. So today we're going to be talking about the Lake Apopka restoration and specifically focusing on submerged aquatic habitat in the lake. Now, I want to start off by saying that this picture is not Lake Apopka. It is part of our district template, but it could be soon. So the St. Johns River Water Management District goes from the Georgia border all the way down to Vero. And Lake Apopka is located right where that red arrow is, and it's our 4th largest lake in Florida. And it is also the headwater lake for the Ocklawaha River Basin. So whatever comes from Lake Apopka flows downstream. The immediate watershed for Lake Apopka is about 183 square miles. It's depicted by this red boundary line here. The lake itself is about 48 square miles. And I will be talking briefly about our property on the north shore of Lake Apopka, called Lake Apopka North Shore. And that is about 30 square miles. Now you can look in this picture, and this picture is from '95, and you can see all the development in the area. This has been a rapidly developing area. It is in Lake and Orange counties. And so we've had some challenges managing the nutrient runoff into the lake from previous legacy farms and whatnot, and then also from all the development. So submerged aquatic plants provide habitat for aquatic animals and invertebrates to forage and to shelter from predators. Lake Apopka used to be full of aquatic plants. It used to have very clear water, and it used to have a well-known, world-renowned fishery. So it would bring tourism to the area with fish camps and vacation spots, and people came from all over the place. So you can see this old photo of these men that went to Major's Fish Camp and caught all these fish in the lake. But let's give a brief history on Lake Apopka, and then we'll come up to date and see where it is now. So Lake Apopka was connected to Beauclair by the Beauclair Canal in 1893. In the 40s, the whole North Shore wetlands were beginning to be drained for farming. So you can see this picture here of all the farm fields. But in 1947, there were lake-wide algal blooms. So lake turned green, light couldn't penetrate, and these became chronic. So in the 50s, the sport fishing declined. The rough fish, which are the ones that forage on the bottom and stir up sediments, they increased in numbers, and the submerged aquatic plants declined. And by the 60s, the plants were decimated. There were fish kills, the fish camps closed. It was a real mess. So in the 70s, the state and local agencies were studying the lake as to why this happened. They identified some point source solution and strove to make things to do to reduce those. And in the 80s and 90s, they did some legislative actions, and these provided lake water quality standards, and one in particular that we pay attention to is phosphorus at 55 parts per billion. And that's part of the fertilizer that has been used in the lake, but also from runoff from the surrounding areas. It also provided rulemaking authority to the Water Management District and also gave us funds to be able to buy out the farm property. And so that became this yellow area here, which is the Lake Apopka North Shore. And we are in the process of restoring this and returning it to wetlands. But what we're going to talk today about is the lake itself. So let's back up just a little bit. In 1939, the farms hadn't developed yet, and you can even see in this old aerial photograph, you can see that there was submerged aquatic plants in the water. So prior to the mid-40s, Lake Apopka had clear water, had lots of plants. And then the farms came, they improved, added levees, canals for drainage, and they were farming and applying fertilizer, and all that runoff and water was discharged to the lake. So by 1947, there was the first chronic algal bloom occurred in the lake, and after that, like I said, it became chronic. So there were repetitive algal blooms, and when you have an algal bloom, it cuts off the water, the light to the plants, and if you have chronic repetitive ones and the plants don't get light, the plants will either die back, and if they don't have a chance to regenerate, then they will disappear, and that is what happened in the lake. So here's an example. I believe this picture is from the 90s, so that was more than 20 years ago. There's high nutrient loading feeding chronic algal blooms in the lake for many years, and this neon greenness of these algal blooms was visible from space. So Representative Everett Kelly named Lake Apopka the Central Florida's Emerald Badge of Shame. And we have been working ever since we have gotten the properties and everything in the 90s to improve the lake and try to get it back to its pristine condition. So we have a multi-pronged approach to restoring Lake Apopka. In the watershed itself, we've worked to reduce nutrient inputs by reducing stormwater input to the lake and getting that treated before it comes in, acquiring high nutrient input properties. So we got all the well, not all, but we got a lot of the farmland on the North Shore, and we treat that water before it's put into the lake. And we set total maximum daily loads and what's allowable with the Florida Department of Environmental Protection for the lake water quality. We've also created the marsh flowway on our property, which is a passive wetland system that extracts nutrients, particularly the phosphorus, and it also extracts suspended solids, and then that water goes back into the lake when it's clean. We're also restoring wetlands on the North Shore, which is what I touched on before, but we have a lot of in-lake projects to improve water quality, which includes rough fish harvesting, because they stir up sediment, invasive plant control, which FWC has taken over, planting aquatic and wetland plants, as well as monitoring the condition of the lake and its aquatic plants. And so today in this presentation, we're going to be focusing mainly on the planting of the wetland and aquatic plants and the monitoring of the habitat and how it's been doing. So some of our lake restoration goals are to reduce algal blooms, reduce nutrients, improve water clarity and light penetration into the water, restore habitat, so wetland and aquatic habitat. And there is something that does all of these things, and it does it naturally and it does it by itself. And what that is submerged aquatic plants. So submerged aquatic plants do all of these things naturally by themselves. So why are they important? So they provide the ecosystem services that improve water quality. They reduce turbidity, which is the cloudiness of the water, and suspended solids, which is when the flocculent soil is stirred up and it doesn't fall out right away. It stays suspended. The light penetration for the plants, it increases the light penetration and makes the water clearer and the light able to penetrate deeper. It uptakes nutrients from the water. They do all these things naturally. And so what it also does is it creates better conditions for itself and allows it to spread, which also allows it to do more of that because there's more of it, doing these ecosystem services. One of the other things that it does is it decreases wave action, so it can minimize erosion, protect the levees and the shorelines, and it provides calmer areas to protect from the wave forces for other aquatic plants to flourish and spread. So for example, this is my child cartoon drawing to illustrate this. So you can see some aquatic plants here struggling deep, trying to get in. This green is an illustration of some of the algae, and the brown is an illustration of some of the suspended sediment. So what happens is this flocculent sediment is easily stirred up by the fish and the turtles and boats and plant movement. And if you have too much of that, the plants can be smothered, and so they can only grow so deep because the light can only penetrate so far. But if you can get the plants established, the plants themselves will trap the algae in the sediment and allow it to settle and to settle into the bed. The water will be calmer. The wave action would be lesser where these plants are. And the light, the water column will be clearer and the light can penetrate deeper. And this is a biofeedback loop that keeps perpetuating itself. So the plants themselves help clean and clear the water. And so the more plants we can get in the lake, the more the water can get cleaned and cleared naturally. And, the more we have, the more it can do. But plants cannot live without light. So this is an aerial photo from about 20 years ago of the lake. You could see the boat going across. You could see this brown stripe, and that's the flocculent sediment getting stirred up by the boat. And plants cannot live without light. So all this algae, all this flocculent sediment basically decimated and wiped out the plants because they did not have any light to live. But we made improvements to water quality. We were reducing external phosphorus inputs. We were decreasing suspended solids in the water. We were decreasing sediment resuspension by taking out some of those fish that did that the most. And we found that eventually the plants started trying to grow and were able to grow. And so we found aquatic plants established in 1995. These are the first eelgrass beds. There were 2 that we found in 95, so we were super excited when that happened. But these were the first 2. So after this, we actually started monitoring because there was actually vegetation to monitor. So we monitor submerged aquatic habitat. And what that is submerged aquatic vegetation, so underwater plants, and emergent floating leaf vegetation, which are lily pads. And the reason why we monitor these in particular is because these are the best habitat for fish. And so a main goal is to try to have habitat for fish and to get that fishery to be back and functioning. Some of the native submerged aquatic plants, these underwater plants, are southern naiad, up here, coontail, eelgrass, and Illinois pondweed had been eradicated from the lake, and we had not had any regrowth of Illinois pondweed. But in 2018, we did a contract and have been doing some experiments, and we have reintroduced it, and it is doing great. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. So the floating leaved plants, these are the lily pads. So this is spatterdock, an American lotus, and yellow water lily. Those are the dominant ones that we have. So to monitor, we took this 40-mile perimeter of the lake, and we have divvied it up into about 550, 500-meter segments. And we've been mapping these transects, not all of them all the time. Some years previously we did when we didn't have that many plants. Now we have too many plants to map the whole lake. But we've been mapping since 1997. And we've recently added a perimeter presence absence survey, and we're going to go over that really quick right now. And so the presence absence survey, we go, and on each of those transects, we say whether we have any submerged aquatic habitat, what kind it is, whether it's submerged aquatic vegetation, the underwater plants, or whether it's the lily pads. And when you look at this, you may not be able to tell the difference between the light and the dark green, but that's okay. What I want you to take home from this is that in 2019, we went from 0 plants. In 2019, we had 90% of the shoreline had habitat. So that's amazing. We were really excited about that. So this doesn't actually quantify how much, but it tells you whether it was there or not. So we also go out and map plants using our global positioning systems and actually get polygons where we can put them on a map and see where everything is and how it changes over time. One of the other things we do with this is do some sediment data that we take, and we also take some depth information. And here's an example of one of the sites that we did in 2018 and what those polygons looked like. So we walked around the whole bed of plants and mapped it out. So one of the things to take home from this is that if we can't see it, if we can't feel it, if we can't find it, we don't map it. So we feel this is very conservative because we do know that there are at different times of year with different heights of water and, with different areas of plant growth that we don't see and find everything. So we think this is a very conservative method and that the lake is probably doing a little bit better than we can quantify, but this is the best we can do. So I had it suggested to me to put a shoreline on this, but I didn't want to because what was really exciting to me is that this is one of the first years that we could put our polygon data up and you can kind of see the shoreline of the lake. So I thought that was pretty neat. So this is our polygon data on what we have mapped in 2019. So these are our 2019 results, and we mapped approximately 20% of the shoreline. So these are random transects all around the lake, about 20% of the shoreline. And we ended up mapping almost 43 acres ourselves, which is a lot. It's been more than previous. So we were really excited how well the lake was doing. So our lake-wide estimate, when you take are 43 acres, and we have some math that we do to upscale that for a lake-wide estimate, and it ends up being almost 202 acres of naturally occurring submerged aquatic habitat. And that is the native plants that are there that are spreading naturally. So we have some other areas that we know that we've planted and they've expanded too, and we've been keeping track of that. And so we keep track of those separately. So if you add those together, we have a total lake-wide acreage of approximately 352 acres for 2019. So that's absolutely amazing to go from 0 to that much habitat in the lake. So we've been very excited. So this is, I promise, it's the only graph I'm going to show you. It shows you how we went from basically 0 species and 0 acres and have gone up to approximately 202 acres of naturally occurring habitat. So that's amazing. And we really think we're hitting a tipping point, and we're hope that it's just going to keep improving. So let's talk about some things we've done in the past for plantings, our previous restoration plantings. We have worked with FWC and done some plantings on many different sites. Now, up until recently, they've had a hard time getting the submerged aquatic plants, the underwater plants, to persist and expand with the plantings. And part of that, I think, is the water clarity and water quality and light penetration. The ones they've had most success with have been the lily pads, the floating emergents. And then also FWC has done some emergent plantings for this, but we don't monitor that as part of our program for habitat. So another project we've done recently with the lily pads was in 2019. We did an emergent and floating leaf planting project. We planted 28,000 plants, and so we had over 26,000 spatterdock, about almost 1,500 yellow water lily, and 600 American lotus plants that we installed in the lake. And you can see this contractor here tying it up on the weight. So the weight is concrete, and then he tied it with twine, natural twine. And then we would put them in the lake, and they ended up usually being in rows because you're just dumping them out as you drive the boat. And so the leaves float up, the roots stay down with the weight, and they end up rooting and filling themselves in and start to look something like this. And so you could see the rows of where we've had planted previously, and they're starting to fill in. And eventually this will be one big block of plants. So we were excited about that and getting those 28,000 plants in the lake to provide extra habitat. We do underwater planting. Recently, we have a contract with the University of Florida, and they are looking at all the different sites and locations and information specific to Lake Apopka. So we're going to take their information and upscale that to a larger scale planting. So they've been planting with different methods. They have this burrito method here. This is a bare root method, so there's just the plant itself and a weight tied to it, and you dump that over the side and it falls down, it's weighed down, and it roots in. And this is really exciting because this is the reintroduced Illinois pondweed, and you can see here that we have some sites that are doing phenomenally. They are flowering, they are seeding. We have some tests going to see whether those are viable seeds, and we hope that they will spread across the lake and be able to perpetuate themselves. So this project is going to inform the next project, and we have an upcoming project this year with Lake Apopka SAV planting, so the underwater plants, and we will be potentially planting 24 additional acres. Will be mostly eelgrass and maybe some pondweed. So we're pretty excited about that project coming up soon. So I touched briefly on a partnership with FWC before for planting, but they also do some vegetation monitoring. And this year they have decided that they are going to map Lake Apopka. So they do that with sonar and ground truthing. So they have a grid and they run the boat with the sonar, and they have ground truthing data that they collect at certain points. And then they end up with kind of a heat map. So here's an example of a subset of Lake Apopka where we did a test map. And so eventually, as soon as they finish processing their data, we're hoping to have a vegetation map for the entire lake for this year. So we're pretty excited to be able to take all our data and put that on a map with this and compare it and see how things are going. So these are the main projects we have going on. This is the restoration that we've done. And so if anybody wants to talk about it, we can. We have had so many people work on Lake Apopka and on any of our restoration projects that I couldn't possibly name them all. This is only a short subset of them, but we are greatly appreciative to everybody that has worked on it. And if anybody has any questions, I can try to answer them.
Thank you so much, Jody, for that fabulous overview and description about the restoration efforts and the successful restoration efforts. I think that's always an important thing to remember, is that not only is it an effort and restoration that's going on, but it is a success. We do have a ton of questions coming in, so I do want to remind y'all that we will stop at 11. And any of the questions that we do not get to, we will come back to you directly. There was one question that brought up the connection between, or the water quality benefits of those littoral area plants, but you mentioned that you weren't necessarily focused on those emergent vegetation zones because you're focused on the habitat. Could you elaborate maybe a little bit on the water quality benefits and the habitat dichotomy?
Sure. So there are emergent plants. There's some cattail, there's bulrush, there's other plants, other native wetland plants that are all along the shorelines, and they provide great water quality services. So they'll uptake nutrients and do that sort of thing, and help clean the water. They don't do as much settling of the water column because they're usually on the edges and they only go so deep. So the aquatic plants go deeper and they provide that in more of a water aquatic setting. So the emergent plants on the side of the lake, they do have uses, but usually they're also really thickly packed together, and so they're not as good habitat for fish and aquatic invertebrates. Sometimes some aquatic invertebrates can go in there and do things like apple snails on the edges and whatnot, but fish have a hard time getting in them, and there's not quite as much for them to hide in or eat, and thick stands of cattail or Ponaderia, they can't get in there. So we've focused on the plants and the areas that provide the best fisheries habitat.
Okay, thank you. Is there anybody that you know of studying turtle populations in the lake, or have turtle populations been problematic at all for your causing the herbivory to the patches of SAV that you're helping to establish?
Yeah, we haven't had too many problems with turtles eating our plants. I do believe that there is a professor in Stetson that has a long-term turtle project, and I think Lake Apopka is one of the areas that they come out and do stuff on. I know they do stuff in the springs as well, but we don't have anything going on like that.
There was one question about, I think you touched on it briefly, about how the muck influence and the poor visibility influences SAV establishment, but does it also inhibit the SAV proliferation?
So we originally thought it would, and I'm sure there are some places that are that it might, especially if it's either really deep or an area where it gets stirred up a whole bunch. But we have actually found plants growing on top of and in the flocculent areas. So we've actually been happily surprised Now, some of those areas, we worry about them with wave action or getting affected and ripped up simply because they are not as stable when they're growing in those areas. But we have found that they have been growing in some of those areas.
Fabulous. It looks like, well, let's have one more question real quickly. And that was a question focused on, you mentioned water lotus. Are there specific areas that water lotus are able to be found?
Yeah, so there's a cove on the west side, just north of the Montverde boat ramp, that has some really nice water lotus. What we found with our American lotus, what we found with that is that you can go and it'll look like it's dying and dead, and then you can come back, 6 months, a year to you later, and it'll be all over the place. So we haven't quite figured out some of that, but it has been persisting. So we're pretty happy with that population. We have planted in a couple other areas, so we're still waiting to see how those do and curious as to how those plants were do. That's part of the reason we only planted 600. We didn't want to plant tons of them if we didn't know they would do well. We do know that the spatterdock and the yellow water lily do well in almost all parts of the lake. So we didn't want to put a whole lot of money into American lotus plantings in different areas until we have a better idea of what's affecting their survival.
Fabulous. Well, thank you all. We will reach out to you that did not get your questions answered in this. We do want to honor everybody's time. We appreciate your attendance. Jody, thank you for that fabulous presentation. I hope everyone has a great day and join us for our next webinar. It will be in 2 weeks and it will be focused on agricultural advancements and helping with water conservation, and which always helps with water quality as well. So please join us for that. And thank you so much.
Thank you.